The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine gardens of Willowbrook Palace, where Lady Catherine Ashworth walked briskly along the cobblestone path, her emerald dress rustling against the perfectly manicured hedges. As the king's new wife and stepmother to the royal children, she had been trying for months to find her place in this ancient institution, but every day seemed to bring new challenges that tested her patience and resolve. Princess Charlotte Rose, barely 8 years old, sat on her favorite marble bench near the fountain, her golden curls catching the sunlight as she carefully arranged her collection of pressed flowers in a leather-bound journal. The young princess had been struggling to accept her new stepmother ever since her father's remarriage 6 months ago, and today was no different from the countless other mornings filled with tension and unspoken resentment. The palace grounds were unusually quiet this Tuesday morning, with most of the staff attending to their duties inside the grand halls. Only the distant sound of gardeners working in the eastern wing could be heard, along with the gentle splash of water from the ornate fountain that had stood in the center of the garden for over 2 centuries. Lady Catherine had specifically chosen this time for what she hoped would be a peaceful conversation with her stepdaughter, away from the prying eyes and listening ears that seemed to follow her everywhere within these ancient walls. As she approached the bench where Princess Charlotte sat absorbed in her delicate work, Lady Catherine noticed the child's shoulders tense slightly, a reaction that had become all too familiar over the past months. The princess continued her meticulous arrangement of dried lavender and rose petals, her small fingers working with the precision of someone far beyond her years, but the subtle shift in her posture made it clear that she was very much aware of her stepmother's presence. Lady Catherine had been the Duchess of Ravenhill before her marriage to the king, a woman known throughout the kingdom for her charitable work and diplomatic skills, but none of her previous experiences had prepared her for the complexity of becoming a mother figure to royal children who still grieved for their late mother. The Queen had passed away 3 years earlier in a tragic riding accident, leaving behind 2 young children who had become the center of the kingdom's attention and sympathy. The morning breeze carried the scent of blooming jasmine and freshly cut grass as Lady Catherine finally reached the bench, her heart beating faster than usual as she prepared to address yet another incident that had occurred the previous evening. Princess Charlotte had been found in the library after midnight, reading by candlelight despite explicit instructions to remain in her chambers after dinner, and this latest act of defiance was just one in a long series of behavioral issues that seemed to escalate with each passing week. Standing beside the marble bench, Lady Catherine could see that the princess had been working on a particularly intricate flower arrangement, one that depicted a small cottage surrounded by gardens, complete with tiny figures made from twisted stems and petals. The artwork was remarkably sophisticated for a child of 8, displaying both creativity and attention to detail that reminded Lady Catherine of the late Queen's own artistic talents, which had been legendary throughout the kingdom and beyond. The silence stretched between them like an invisible wall, thick with unresolved emotions and unspoken grievances that had been building since the day Lady Catherine had first set foot in Willowbrook Palace. The princess continued her work with deliberate focus, her small hands steady despite the tension that radiated from her tiny frame, while Lady Catherine searched for the right words to begin what she knew would be a difficult conversation about respect, boundaries, and the importance of following palace rules. A pair of sparrows landed on the fountain's edge, chirping softly as they dipped their beaks into the cool water, their innocent presence providing a stark contrast to the heavy atmosphere that surrounded the 2 human figures near the bench. Lady Catherine had always believed that patience and understanding were the keys to building relationships with children, but her stepdaughter seemed determined to test every limit and challenge every attempt at connection with a stubbornness that rivaled that of her late mother. The morning grew warmer as clouds began to gather in the distance, threatening rain that would likely drive them both indoors before their conversation could reach any meaningful resolution. Lady Catherine knew that time was running short, and that she needed to address not only the previous night's incident but also the growing pattern of behavior that was causing concern among the palace staff and members of the royal council who had begun to whisper about the princess's increasingly rebellious nature. Princess Charlotte finally looked up from her flower arrangement, her bright blue eyes meeting Lady Catherine's gaze with a mixture of defiance and curiosity that seemed to capture the complex emotions swirling beneath her composed exterior. In that moment, Lady Catherine could see so much of the late Queen in her stepdaughter's features, from the determined set of her small jaw to the intelligent spark in her eyes that suggested she understood far more about the adult world than anyone realized. The fountain continued its gentle melody as the 2 figures faced each other in the garden, surrounded by centuries of royal history and tradition, yet feeling completely alone in their struggle to find common ground. Lady Catherine had entered this marriage with hopes of creating a loving blended family, but the reality of step-parenting royal children was proving to be far more challenging than anything she had ever imagined, requiring skills and patience that seemed to be tested anew with each passing day. Birds continued their morning songs in the ancient oak trees that bordered the garden, their cheerful calls providing a soundtrack to what was about to become one of the most significant conversations in both of their lives, though neither Lady Catherine nor Princess Charlotte could have predicted how dramatically the next few minutes would change everything they thought they knew about their relationship and their roles within the royal family structure. The palace clock tower chimed 9 times, marking the official beginning of another day in the life of Willowbrook Palace, where tradition and protocol governed every aspect of daily existence, from the way meals were served to the manner in which family members were expected to interact with one another. Lady Catherine took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she hoped would be a breakthrough moment in her relationship with the young princess who had been testing every boundary since their first meeting months ago. As she prepared to speak, Lady Catherine noticed that Princess Charlotte's flower arrangement seemed to tell a story of its own, with the cottage at the center surrounded by protective barriers made of thorns and dried branches, as if the small figures inside were trying to keep the outside world at bay. The symbolism was not lost on her stepmother, who realized that perhaps the princess's artistic creation was actually a reflection of her own emotional state and her desperate need to maintain some sense of control in a life that had been turned upside down by loss and change. Lady Catherine cleared her throat gently, breaking the silence that had settled over the garden like morning mist. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried the measured tone she had learned to use in diplomatic situations, though her heart raced with the uncertainty of how her stepdaughter might respond to what needed to be addressed about the previous night's incident and the growing pattern of defiant behavior that had become increasingly difficult to ignore. Princess Charlotte's fingers paused in their delicate work with the flower arrangement, but she did not look up immediately, instead focusing intently on a particularly stubborn rose petal that refused to stay in place among the tiny cottage's garden scene. The silence that followed Lady Catherine's gentle throat clearing seemed to stretch endlessly, filled with the weight of months of unresolved tension and the complexity of their unusual relationship that neither had quite figured out how to navigate successfully. The morning air grew heavier with the promise of rain as dark clouds continued to gather overhead, casting shifting shadows across the garden that seemed to mirror the emotional turbulence brewing between the stepmother and stepdaughter who sat frozen in this moment of potential confrontation. Lady Catherine had rehearsed various approaches to this conversation during her sleepless night, but now that the moment had arrived, she found herself struggling to find the right words that might penetrate the walls her stepdaughter had built around herself. When Princess Charlotte finally raised her eyes to meet Lady Catherine's gaze, there was a flash of something that looked almost like fear mixed with the familiar defiance that had become her standard expression whenever adult authority figures attempted to address her increasingly problematic behavior. The 8-year-old had learned to guard her emotions carefully in the months since her father's remarriage, but, in unguarded moments like this, her vulnerability showed through the carefully constructed facade of indifference that she wore like armor. Lady Catherine sat down carefully on the opposite end of the marble bench, maintaining enough distance to avoid making the princess feel trapped while still positioning herself close enough to have an intimate conversation without raising their voices or drawing attention from any palace staff who might be working nearby. The bench felt cold against her back despite the warmth of the morning sun, and she could feel the tension radiating from the small figure beside her like heat from a flame. The fountain's gentle splash provided a soothing backdrop as Lady Catherine finally found her voice and began to address the elephant in the room that had been growing larger with each passing incident of defiance and rule-breaking. Her words came slowly at first, carefully chosen to avoid triggering the defensive reactions that had characterized most of their previous attempts at meaningful communication over the past several months since she had become part of the royal family. Princess Charlotte's hands had stilled completely in her lap, the flower arrangement forgotten as she listened to her stepmother's gentle but firm words about responsibility, respect, and the importance of following palace rules that existed not to restrict her freedom but to ensure her safety and the smooth functioning of the household that employed dozens of people who depended on order and routine for their livelihoods and sense of security within the ancient walls of Willowbrook Palace. The young princess's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as Lady Catherine spoke about the previous night's incident in the library, her blue eyes flashing with the same stubborn determination that her late mother had been famous for throughout the kingdom, a trait that had served the former queen well in diplomatic negotiations but was proving challenging in an 8-year-old who seemed determined to test every boundary and challenge every attempt at guidance or correction from her new stepmother. As the conversation progressed, Lady Catherine found herself walking an increasingly delicate line between firmness and compassion, trying to address the behavioral issues that had been escalating while also acknowledging the grief and confusion that she knew must be driving much of Princess Charlotte's acting out, though the child had never explicitly discussed her feelings about her mother's death or her father's remarriage to someone she barely knew and certainly hadn't chosen to welcome into their previously close-knit family unit. The sound of footsteps on gravel announced the approach of someone else in the garden, but both Lady Catherine and Princess Charlotte remained focused on each other, neither wanting to break the intensity of this moment that felt like it might finally lead to some kind of breakthrough in their strained relationship, even as the tension between them seemed to crackle with the electricity of an approaching thunderstorm that matched the weather building overhead in the increasingly dark sky. Princess Charlotte's small hands clenched into fists in her lap as Lady Catherine's words hit closer and closer to home, touching on topics that the 8-year-old had been trying desperately to avoid thinking about, let alone discussing with the woman who had taken what she perceived as her mother's place in both the palace and in her father's affections, creating a complex web of emotions that she was far too young to untangle or understand fully, despite her obvious intelligence and maturity beyond her years. The approaching footsteps grew louder, but Lady Catherine pressed on with her carefully planned speech about consequences and expectations, knowing that opportunities for private conversations with her stepdaughter were rare and precious, especially ones that seemed to be penetrating the wall of indifference that Princess Charlotte had constructed around herself as protection against further hurt and disappointment in a world that had already taken away the most important person in her young life. Suddenly, the careful balance of their conversation shifted dramatically when Princess Charlotte's composure finally cracked under the pressure of months of suppressed emotion and grief. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was sharp with pain and anger that had been building like water behind a dam, threatening to overflow and sweep away everything in its path, including the fragile attempts at relationship building that Lady Catherine had been so carefully nurturing over the past months despite setback after setback. The words that burst from the princess's lips were like arrows aimed directly at Lady Catherine's heart, accusations and resentments that had been festering in the darkness of unexpressed grief and confusion, delivered with the brutal honesty that only children possess when their emotions finally overwhelm their carefully learned manners and social constraints that adults spend years teaching them to maintain even in the most difficult circumstances and challenging relationships. Lady Catherine felt as if she had been physically struck by the force of her stepdaughter's sudden verbal assault, each word hitting her with the precision of someone who had been watching and listening and storing up grievances for months, waiting for exactly this moment to unleash the full force of her anger and pain on the person she had decided was responsible for all the changes and disruptions that had transformed her previously secure world into something uncertain and frightening. The conversation that Lady Catherine had hoped would be a turning point in their relationship suddenly spiraled completely out of control, with Princess Charlotte's voice rising higher and higher as months of suppressed emotion poured out in a torrent of accusations, complaints, and comparisons to her late mother that cut deeper than any physical wound could have, striking directly at Lady Catherine's deepest insecurities about her role in this family and her ability to ever truly replace the beloved queen in the hearts of her children. As the 8-year-old's words grew more and more hurtful, Lady Catherine found herself fighting to maintain the composure and dignity that had been drilled into her through years of diplomatic training and social conditioning, but the pain of being rejected so completely by a child she had genuinely hoped to love and nurture was almost overwhelming, threatening to break down the careful emotional barriers she had constructed to protect herself from exactly this kind of devastating personal attack. The approaching footsteps had stopped somewhere nearby, suggesting that someone was witnessing this breakdown of what should have been a private family moment, but Princess Charlotte seemed completely unaware of anything beyond her own pain and anger as she continued her emotional tirade, her small face flushed with the intensity of emotions that had been trapped inside her for far too long, finally finding release in this explosive confrontation that was changing everything between them in ways that neither could have predicted. Lady Catherine's hands trembled slightly as she struggled to find some way to respond to this outburst that would de-escalate the situation without compromising her authority or completely abandoning the boundaries that needed to exist between step-parent and child, even in the most emotional circumstances, but the words seemed to stick in her throat as she realized that everything she had believed about building their relationship had been based on assumptions that were apparently completely wrong. The intensity of Princess Charlotte's emotional outburst reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of the peaceful garden setting, her small voice carrying across the manicured landscape with a force that belied her 8 years of age and gentle upbringing, as if all the grief and anger she had been carefully containing since her mother's death had finally found a crack in her armor and was pouring out like water through a burst dam, unstoppable and devastating in its raw honesty and pain. Lady Catherine sat frozen on the marble bench, her carefully planned words of guidance and discipline forgotten in the face of this tsunami of emotion that was washing over both of them, threatening to destroy any possibility of the loving relationship she had dreamed of building with her stepdaughter when she had first agreed to marry the king and become part of this complicated family dynamic that seemed to grow more challenging with each passing day despite her best intentions and efforts. The accusations coming from Princess Charlotte's lips grew more specific and more personal with each passing moment, touching on incidents and observations that the 8-year-old had apparently been cataloging and storing away for months, building a case against her stepmother that included everything from the way she arranged flowers in the palace halls to the manner in which she spoke to the servants, as if every action had been scrutinized and found wanting when measured against the memory of the beloved late queen. Through her tears of frustration and anger, Princess Charlotte's words became increasingly cutting and sophisticated, displaying a level of emotional intelligence and observational skill that was both impressive and heartbreaking in someone so young, as she systematically dismantled every attempt Lady Catherine had made to integrate herself into the family structure and win the affection and respect of the royal children who had been the center of the kingdom's attention since their mother's tragic death. The nearby footsteps had stopped completely, and Lady Catherine became increasingly aware that their private conversation had attracted an audience, though she couldn't bring herself to look away from her stepdaughter's tear-streaked face long enough to identify who might be witnessing this complete breakdown of the diplomatic facade she had been maintaining for months in her efforts to establish herself as a worthy successor to the late queen's role in both the palace and the hearts of the people. As Princess Charlotte's voice reached a particularly sharp peak of accusation, something inside Lady Catherine finally snapped with an almost audible breaking sound, like a violin string stretched too tight under the pressure of trying to produce the perfect note, and, suddenly, all her months of patience and careful diplomacy evaporated in the heat of her own rising anger and frustration at being constantly rejected and criticized by a child who seemed determined to make her life as difficult as possible. The words that erupted from Lady Catherine's mouth came from a place of pain and exhaustion that she hadn't even realized existed within herself, a deep well of hurt and disappointment that had been growing larger with each failed attempt at connection, each cold shoulder from her stepdaughter, each reminder that she would always be seen as an interloper in a family that had been complete and happy before her arrival, despite the king's obvious loneliness and need for companionship. Her voice, when she finally responded to Princess Charlotte's tirade, carried a sharpness that surprised even herself, cutting through the morning air with the precision of a blade that had been honed by months of suppressed frustration and the growing realization that all her efforts to win her stepdaughter's acceptance had been not only futile but apparently unwelcome and resented, as if her very presence in the palace was a constant reminder of loss rather than a promise of new beginnings. The transformation in Lady Catherine's demeanor was so sudden and complete that Princess Charlotte's own emotional outburst faltered for a moment, her blue eyes widening with something that looked almost like fear as she realized that she had pushed her stepmother beyond some invisible boundary that she hadn't even known existed, crossing from the safety of being an upset child into the dangerous territory of having wounded a proud adult beyond their capacity for patience and understanding. The words that poured from Lady Catherine's lips were not the measured, diplomatic responses that had characterized all their previous interactions, but rather the raw, unfiltered thoughts and feelings that she had been carefully suppressing in her efforts to be the perfect stepmother to children who had made it clear from day one that they neither wanted nor appreciated her presence in their lives, despite her genuine desire to love and nurture them as if they were her own. As her voice rose to match and, then, exceed the volume of Princess Charlotte's accusations, Lady Catherine found herself saying things that she would never have imagined herself capable of saying to a child, words that came from a place of such deep hurt and frustration that they seemed to bypass her usual filters of appropriateness and kindness, striking back at the 8-year-old with the same brutal honesty that had been directed at her moments before. The flower arrangement that Princess Charlotte had been working on so carefully tumbled from the bench to scatter across the gravel path, the delicate petals and stems that had been arranged into a perfect miniature cottage garden now crushed underfoot as both figures rose from the marble bench, their voices echoing off the palace walls with an intensity that seemed to draw the attention of everyone within hearing distance, though neither was aware of anything beyond their own pain and anger. Princess Charlotte took a step backward as Lady Catherine's words hit her with unexpected force, her small face crumpling not just with her own grief and anger now, but with the dawning realization that she had succeeded in hurting someone who had been trying however, imperfectly, to care for her, and that the satisfaction she had expected to feel from finally expressing her resentment was being replaced by something much more complicated and uncomfortable that she was too young to identify as guilt. The sound of running footsteps on gravel announced the approach of someone moving quickly toward the scene of this confrontation, but both Lady Catherine and Princess Charlotte seemed locked in their bubble of mutual pain and accusation, unable to step back from the precipice they had reached in their relationship, where months of careful politeness and suppressed emotion had finally exploded into this raw display of hurt feelings and disappointed expectations on both sides. Lady Catherine's final words rang out across the garden with a finality that seemed to settle over the scene like dust after an explosion, her voice carrying such pain and disappointment that even Princess Charlotte, in her emotional state, could not mistake the genuine hurt behind the anger, the real grief of a woman who had entered this family with love and hope only to find herself constantly rejected and criticized by the very people she had most wanted to cherish and protect. The silence that followed was deafening in its completeness, broken only by the gentle splash of the fountain and the distant rumble of thunder from the approaching storm that seemed to mirror the emotional tempest that had just torn through the peaceful garden setting, leaving both figures standing among the scattered remains of the flower arrangement like survivors of some natural disaster, unsure of how to begin picking up the pieces of what had been destroyed. As the echo of Lady Catherine's words faded into the morning air, both stepmother and stepdaughter seemed to realize simultaneously that they had crossed a line from which there might be no return, that the careful dance of politeness and mutual avoidance they had been performing for months had finally collapsed into something raw and honest and potentially devastating to any future relationship they might hope to build together as members of the same family unit within the ancient walls of Willowbrook Palace. Captain Marcus Whitfield of the Royal Guard had been making his routine morning patrol of the palace grounds when the sound of raised voices drew his attention toward the central garden, his trained ear immediately recognizing the difference between normal conversation and the kind of emotional confrontation that required careful assessment to determine whether intervention might be necessary to protect the safety and dignity of the royal family members involved in what appeared to be escalating into a serious domestic dispute. Standing partially concealed behind one of the ancient oak trees that bordered the garden pathways, Captain Whitfield found himself in the uncomfortable position of witnessing what was clearly meant to be a private family conversation that had spiraled completely out of control, his professional instincts warring with his respect for royal privacy as he watched Lady Catherine and Princess Charlotte engage in an emotional battle that seemed to be causing pain to both participants in ways that went far beyond simple disciplinary correction or childhood defiance. The veteran guard had served the royal family for over 15 years, having begun his career during the reign of the late Queen, and he had witnessed many private family moments over the years, but nothing had prepared him for the raw intensity of emotion that was now playing out before his eyes as both stepmother and stepdaughter seemed to lose all sense of royal protocol and proper behavior in their desperate need to express months of suppressed feelings and frustrations. As Lady Catherine's voice rose to meet and exceed Princess Charlotte's accusations, Captain Whitfield found himself remembering the gentle, diplomatic woman who had first arrived at Willowbrook Palace 6 months earlier, her obvious nervousness about joining the royal family balanced by a genuine warmth and desire to create loving relationships with her new stepchildren, a stark contrast to the pain-filled figure he now observed lashing out with words that seemed designed to wound rather than heal or educate. The transformation he was witnessing in both figures was so complete and dramatic that Captain Whitfield began to understand that this was not simply a disciplinary conversation gone wrong, but rather the culmination of months of building tension and unresolved grief that had finally found expression in this explosive confrontation that was threatening to damage relationships that might never fully recover from the wounds being inflicted with such precision and fury. His hand moved instinctively toward the communication device that would allow him to alert other palace staff to the situation, but something about the raw honesty of what he was witnessing made him hesitate, recognizing that this moment might actually be necessary for both Lady Catherine and Princess Charlotte to move past the artificial politeness that had been preventing them from addressing the real issues underlying their troubled relationship since the royal wedding had made them family. When Lady Catherine's final, devastating words rang out across the garden with such force that they seemed to echo off the palace walls themselves, Captain Whitfield realized that the situation had moved beyond what could be resolved through private family communication and required the kind of intervention that only someone outside the immediate family dynamic could provide, though he was acutely aware of how delicate such intervention would need to be to avoid making the situation worse. The silence that followed Lady Catherine's outburst was so complete and heavy with emotional weight that Captain Whitfield could hear his own heartbeat as he stepped carefully out from behind the oak tree, his polished boots making deliberate contact with the gravel path to announce his presence without startling either of the emotionally overwrought figures who stood frozen in their confrontation like actors in a tragic play who had forgotten their lines and were waiting for direction from someone in the wings. Both Lady Catherine and Princess Charlotte turned toward the sound of his approaching footsteps with expressions of shock and embarrassment that made it clear they had been completely unaware that their private family crisis had attracted an audience, their faces showing the particular kind of mortification that comes from realizing that one's worst moments have been witnessed by someone whose respect and discretion are essential to maintaining any semblance of dignity within the complex social structure of royal palace life. Captain Whitfield's presence in the garden at that moment carried the weight of his years of service and his reputation for absolute discretion in family matters, but also the authority of someone who had been entrusted with the security and well-being of every member of the royal family, including the responsibility to intervene when situations arose that might threaten their physical safety, emotional health, or public reputation, regardless of how uncomfortable such intervention might be for all parties involved. As he approached the scene of scattered flower petals and emotional devastation, Captain Whitfield's mind raced through the various protocols and procedures that governed his interactions with royal family members during personal crises, balancing his duty to maintain appropriate boundaries with his genuine concern for both Lady Catherine and Princess Charlotte, who appeared to be equally wounded by what had just transpired between them in this previously peaceful corner of the palace grounds. The look in Princess Charlotte's eyes as she recognized the guard captain was a complex mixture of relief and terror, relief that adult intervention might end this confrontation that had spiraled so far beyond her control, but terror that her private emotional breakdown and the hurtful words she had spoken might become known beyond this small circle, potentially affecting her relationship with her father and her standing within the palace community that had been her entire world since birth. Lady Catherine's reaction to Captain Whitfield's appearance was equally complex, her diplomatic training immediately reasserting itself as she recognized the need to regain her composure and dignity in the presence of palace staff, while simultaneously grappling with the humiliation of having lost control so completely in front of someone whose discretion would be essential to preventing this incident from becoming gossip that could undermine her still fragile position within the royal household and the broader kingdom community. The weight of the moment seemed to press down on all three figures as they stood in the garden surrounded by the evidence of emotional destruction, each aware that whatever words were spoken next would determine not only how this immediate crisis was resolved, but also how the relationships between them would evolve in the days and weeks to come, with potential ramifications that could affect the stability and harmony of the entire royal family structure. Captain Whitfield cleared his throat gently, a sound that seemed to break the spell of paralysis that had settled over the scene, and, when he spoke, his voice carried the careful neutrality of someone trained to navigate the most delicate diplomatic situations while maintaining respect for all parties involved, regardless of their emotional state or the nature of the conflicts they were experiencing in their personal relationships within the unique pressures of royal life. His words, when they finally came, were measured and thoughtful, acknowledging the obvious distress of both Lady Catherine and Princess Charlotte while also subtly reminding them of their positions within the royal family and the expectations that came with those roles, even in their most private and painful moments, creating a bridge between the raw emotion of what had just occurred and the need to move forward in a manner that preserved dignity while also addressing the underlying issues that had led to this explosive confrontation. The simple phrase that Captain Whitfield chose to break the silence was so perfectly calibrated to the situation that it seemed to unlock something in both Lady Catherine and Princess Charlotte, allowing them to step back from the emotional precipice they had reached and begin to see their conflict from a different perspective, one that acknowledged their mutual pain while also opening the door to the possibility of healing and understanding that had seemed impossible just moments before. When they were locked in their cycle of accusation and counter-accusation, the 9 words that Captain Whitfield spoke into the heavy silence of the garden would later be remembered by both Lady Catherine and Princess Charlotte as the moment when their relationship truly began, though neither could have predicted such an outcome from what had seemed like its complete destruction just moments before, when their confrontation had reached levels of pain and anger that appeared to have damaged their connection beyond any possibility of repair or reconciliation within the complex dynamics of their blended royal family. "Your Majesty, perhaps we all need some tea," Captain Whitfield said with such gentle authority and perfect timing that the simple suggestion seemed to transform the entire atmosphere of the garden, acknowledging the formality of royal protocol while simultaneously offering a practical solution that would allow both emotional combatants to retreat with dignity intact and time to process what had occurred between them during this explosive morning confrontation that had stripped away months of careful politeness. The genius of his words lay not just in their content but in their delivery and timing, coming at precisely the moment when both Lady Catherine and Princess Charlotte were most in need of a graceful exit from a situation that had spiraled beyond their ability to control or resolve through continued emotional expression, providing them with a face-saving opportunity to step back from their conflict without having to admit defeat or acknowledge fault in front of each other or the witnessing guard captain. Princess Charlotte was the first to respond to Captain Whitfield's suggestion, her 8-year-old mind immediately grasping the lifeline he had thrown to both her and her stepmother, allowing her to nod silently while wiping her tear-streaked cheeks with the back of her small hand, her earlier defiance now replaced by something that looked suspiciously like relief that this overwhelming emotional experience might be coming to an end through adult intervention rather than further confrontation. That could only cause more pain. Lady Catherine's reaction was more complex, her diplomatic training warring with her emotional exhaustion as she struggled to regain the composure that had been completely shattered by the intensity of her exchange with Princess Charlotte, but Captain Whitfield's words provided her with exactly the framework she needed to begin rebuilding her dignity while also acknowledging that professional help might be necessary to navigate the family dynamics that had proven far more challenging than she had ever anticipated. The walk back to the palace was conducted in silence that felt completely different from the tense quiet that had characterized the early moments of their garden encounter, with Captain Whitfield maintaining a respectful distance behind the two female members of the royal family while remaining close enough to provide support or intervention if the emotional temperature began to rise again, his presence serving as both protection and gentle reminder of appropriate behavior and protocol. As they approached the palace doors, Princess Charlotte surprised everyone, including herself, by reaching out to take Lady Catherine's hand in a gesture that was so spontaneous and genuine that it seemed to come from a place deeper than conscious thought, her small fingers intertwining with her stepmother's in a moment of connection that acknowledged their shared pain without requiring words or formal apologies that neither was quite ready to offer or accept in their current emotional state. The tea service that Captain Whitfield had suggested was arranged in the small sitting room adjacent to the main family quarters, a space that had been designed for intimate family gatherings rather than formal court functions, its comfortable furnishings and warm color palette creating an atmosphere that seemed to encourage honest communication while maintaining the dignity appropriate to royal family interactions, even during times of personal crisis and emotional upheaval. Over steaming cups of Earl Grey and delicate pastries that neither Lady Catherine nor Princess Charlotte had any appetite for, the conversation that emerged was halting at first, filled with careful apologies and tentative acknowledgments of hurt feelings, but gradually gaining momentum as both stepmother and stepdaughter began to express their genuine concerns and fears about their relationship and their respective roles within the complex structure of royal family life that demanded both personal connection and public dignity. Captain Whitfield excused himself after ensuring that the tea service was properly arranged and that both ladies appeared to be engaging in productive dialogue rather than renewed conflict, his discretion in leaving them to continue their conversation privately demonstrating the same wisdom that had led him to intervene at exactly the right moment with exactly the right words to transform what could have been a relationship-ending confrontation into an opportunity for genuine understanding and connection. The breakthrough came when Princess Charlotte, her small hands wrapped around her teacup for warmth and comfort, finally found the courage to speak about her mother's death and her fear that accepting Lady Catherine's love would somehow betray the memory of the woman who had been the center of her world for the first 5 years of her life, a fear that she had never been able to articulate before but which had been driving much of her resistant behavior since her father's remarriage 6 months earlier. Lady Catherine's response to this revelation was everything that her diplomatic training and natural empathy could have hoped for, as she acknowledged the princess's grief and fear while also sharing her own struggles with feeling inadequate to fill the shoes of a woman who had been beloved throughout the kingdom for her warmth, intelligence, and dedication to her family, creating a moment of mutual vulnerability that opened the door to genuine understanding between them. The conversation continued for over 2 hours, touching on topics that ranged from practical household arrangements to deeper questions about love, loss, loyalty, and the possibility of building new relationships without abandoning the memory of what had come before, with both participants gradually discovering that their fundamental desires for family harmony and Mutual affection were not as incompatible as their previous interactions had suggested, despite the complexity of their blended family situation. As the afternoon sun slanted through the sitting room windows, casting warm golden light across the scene of reconciliation, both Lady Catherine and Princess Charlotte began to recognize that their morning confrontation, as painful as it had been for both of them, had actually served a necessary purpose in clearing the air of months of suppressed emotion and unspoken resentment that had been poisoning their attempts to build a genuine relationship based on mutual respect and affection rather than mere obligation and duty. The flower arrangement that had been destroyed during their garden confrontation was recreated together during the final hour of their conversation, with Lady Catherine providing materials and gentle guidance while Princess Charlotte applied her artistic skills to create something new that incorporated elements representing both her late mother's memory and her growing acceptance of her stepmother's place in their family, symbolizing the possibility of honoring the past while embracing the future that was still being written. By the time the palace dinner bells chimed to announce the evening meal, the relationship between Lady Catherine and Princess Charlotte had been fundamentally transformed from one of mutual suspicion and resentment to something that resembled the beginning of genuine affection and understanding, though both recognized that building trust and love would be an ongoing process that would require patience, forgiveness, and continued honest communication about their needs and expectations. Captain Whitfield's 9 simple words had indeed changed everything, not through magic or manipulation, but by providing exactly the right intervention at exactly the right moment to transform destructive conflict into constructive dialogue, demonstrating the power of wisdom, timing, and genuine care for others to create opportunities for healing and growth even in the most challenging family situations that seemed beyond hope of resolution.